everybody, it's Claire here from Sewn by Claire, and again today we're going to be carrying on with our series for our Lilly Rose doll for Lillian the Lamb, this lovely kit here that I was gifted by Lilly Rose Dolls in order that I could bring this sew-along video to you. And you'll be able to see Lillian just peeping over here at the moment. Here she is, looking lovely in her dress. And so far we've made all of the lamb itself, and we've made the white dress, and we've made the bloomers, and now we want to make the floral pinafore that sits over the top of this dress. I mean, she looks beautiful as she is, but there is another dress that goes on top of her, and that's out of this lovely, lovely cream and then peachy coloured and green floral fabric that was in the kit. So I'm going to point the camera down and then we'll get started and we can get Lillian with her pinafore. Okay, so when we're making the pinafore, what we need to do is go into our kit, bring out our pattern pages, and then we're going to need to turn to this last page and we need to have the pattern for the pinafore and for the dress. Now, I'll just go across this just quickly because if you've been following along with me, then you'll already know this. But the Lilly Rose Dolls pattern, you'll only have one line, which is your sewing line on your pattern. You need to add 1/4 inch seam allowance. And the way that I do that is I take a measure like my seam gauge just here, which is the easiest thing I've found to use. And then I just put the 1/4 inch mark onto the drawn line that you'll only have that one pattern. I put a series of dots following my measure all the way round, then I join them together, and you can see the little dots just here, look on the page, just in there. Join those together, and then that's my cutting out line to give me a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way through. That's a really quick visit, but if you've been watching already, you'll be bored of hearing me say this, so I'm just kind of speeding through it. Also, the other thing that I recommend you do is that you trace off your pattern pieces onto tracing paper and keep your master copy intact in your box so that you've got it for future reference. Then in the future, if you do lose a pattern piece, you can go back to your box, get the pattern out, trace off another one, and you're good to go. Okay, that's what I'm going to say on those, because I know that you'll already have heard this several times if you've already been following along with me. The other thing we need to do is go to the instructions, because you'll notice there's no there's no pattern piece for the skirt or for the ruffle at the bottom. Let me just show you how this is. Sorry for all the crumpling, but we've got this lovely gathered skirt pinafore, and then we've got a lovely ruffle along the bottom here as well that we need to put on, and the only pattern pieces we've got is for the front and the back of the pinafore. So let's pop those two pattern pieces that I've traced off to one side, and we'll have a look on here. So we need to cut 2 pieces of fabric 3 inches by 44 inches for the ruffle, and then we need to cut 1 piece which is 5.5 by 32 inches, and that is for the skirt. So before I go ahead and start to use my bodice pieces, I'm going to cut out those biggest pieces first, just so that we don't accidentally cut into fabric that we need for those single pieces of fabric. So we're going to open out our fabric, and we've got a full width here. So we've got 2 selvage edges, and you know, remember I said before about selvage edges, how it's the bound edge. You can get a fluffy little edge on your selvage edge like this, but look, there's printing on the edge there, and there's these little dots, and that's where the fabric has been rolled around the rollers in order that it could be printed on. And they've got this beautiful ditzy print on here, this little floral. Let's just put our selvage edges together to start off with in order that we can get this right. I'm just going to smooth this along. And if you've got creases like this as well from packing, it's a good idea as well to iron those out. But on this piece, because we've got to cut some straight pieces first, I'm now going to take, so see I've got my selvage edges together here nicely. I'm now going to take this folded edge and just fold it along, so along the dot, so I can still see the edge. It's still staggered on the edge of that fabric, but I can see where those dots are and see how neatly that is all lined up. And I'm making sure that the folded edge of my fabric is the equal distance away, just by eye, from the edge of the fabric. And I'm just smoothing that out, making sure, I can feel there's a fold under there. So just making sure that everything is all folded under all nicely. And this is going to give us those lovely long strips that we need. And that has just moved slightly, so just bear with me. That's better, I can feel it straight now. And then I'm going to use my rotary cutter, which is this, which has got a razor blade edge on it, so you do have to be careful. And then also a long quilting ruler, And I will use this one because this will go across the edge here as I want. And quilting rulers are great because they have lots of lines that you can follow, which makes it really easy for cutting long strips. The first thing that I'm going to do is going to put one of my long edges along this folded edge or along the selvage edge, doesn't matter which one you choose, but you need it to go all the way across your fabric, and it needs to be straight on that folded edge to make sure that we can cut off this end first and get the fabric all lovely and straight. And the way that we do that is we put pressure on our ruler and then we release the blade, and then we can put a lot of pressure onto our blade as we cut across just neatly. And then that should, if my blade is strong, it's pretty sharp, but not quite enough for all of those layers. And that takes that off really nice and neatly. And then I'm just going to scrap that. So then the next thing that I do is very carefully I'm going to lift my fabric and turn it round, because we want to be able to use this new cut edge that we've got, and we always put our ruler over the top of the piece of fabric that we're trying to protect. So the first thing we've got to do is cut two pieces of fabric which are 3 inches by 44 inches. So I'll find my 3-inch mark on my ruler here, put that against that newly cut edge that I've just done. Make sure that on the bottom here my ruler is straight against this folded line down the bottom here. I'm going to stand up to do this bit, and I've just moved the camera, sorry about that. And then I'm going to put pressure on, and I'm going to do two cuts with my rotary cutter to make sure that that's come off. And then without moving it, I'm moving my ruler across to the 6-inch mark, lining it up just exactly the same way, and now I'm going to make my second cut. And again, 1 and 2. You can measure up from the hem if you want to, and then obviously cut it that way, but this is, hopefully you can see this is nice and quick and fast and very accurate as well. So that's my 2 strips for my ruffle cut. So let's pop those to one side, because then the next thing that we need to do is do a 5.5 inch by 32 inches. And because we're almost the whole way across, what I'm just going to do is make sure that if I do my 5.5 inches, which is to there, so I'm just resting my ruler on top to see how much room we need for the skirt. Then I'm going to pop these pieces on, and I've got enough room at the top for these pieces of fabric, for these pieces to be cut out. So I know that I can do the whole length of the strip of fabric first, and then I'll come back and I'll cross cut it once we get to the 32 inches. So let's move those pieces of fabric off here. I hope this is all making sense to you. It's a bit of quilting really, and this is where sometimes our sewing disciplines cross over onto each other, isn't it? So hopefully I can show you how the quilting rulers and the rotary cutter can go across into your dressmaking, and it can just make things a little bit easier, especially when you're cutting long straight lines like this, which is great. So I've got my ruler on my 5.5 there. And I'm going to bring my line down here. So we've made sure we've cross-referenced on those 2 planes that we've got that straight piece of fabric. I'm going to put pressure on my piece of on my ruler, and I'm just going to cut all of that piece across there. And I do 2 just because my rotary cutter, it probably needs a sharpen. So I take that piece off, and there's our second piece for our skirt. And now all we need to do is take off the selvage edges, and then we can then cross cut that when it's time to the 32 inches. So let me just take off this selvage edge now. Let me just make sure that's all nice and straight, which it is, and take that off. So that's that section off there. And then I'm going to do the same with both of these. So not the folded edge stays intact, but both of these have got an edge. I'm just going to stagger the ends just slightly, make sure they're straight on top of each other, because then that just helps with the rotary cutter just for going through. I'm just going to take a strip off the end of those, and that will just give those nice clean edges to work with. So just some little bits like this. You can save them for other projects if you want. Okay, so that's got those strips cut. And as I say, if you've not got a rotary cutter, you can just use a tape measure. There's my tape measure gone. You can use a tape measure up from the edge of your fabric, and either make a line with a chalk mark or with a pin, and then you'll have a row, and then you can cut it off. It's just that I do feel that the rotary cutters are slightly more accurate for those pieces. Right, okay, so the next thing then we've got to do is we have got to do our front and our back. What I can do, let's have a think, we want this all to be going the same way. So let's take this across like this, because we need let's just move it across enough, because we need a folded edge for our pinafore front, the fabric for the back. So I can make sure now that I've folded over enough of this strip, and then that's going to give us this bit spare at the end. So now let's just finger press that, make sure the bottom edge that we cut with the rotary cutter is all on top of each other. We can use that for the bottom edge of our bodice top, because that's all fine. And then once we've got that lined up, we can then put our pins in order just to hold all of this lovely and flat. You don't need many pins on these small pieces, but I'm just trying to make sure that you keep your fold line absolutely on the folded edge just there. Move these things out of the way so that you can see. And then with our back piece, we're going to rest the bottom just there, but I'm just going to do a double check to make sure that it's absolutely perfectly straight. And then with our tape, now use our seam gauge here, we can measure from the bottom of that grain line, and we're just over 5 inches. So let me just move it slightly in, and we might be able to get it straight to 5 inches, yes. And then put a pin in the bottom of that just to hold that steady. And now let's go to the top of that line, and we want that to be 5 inches too. It just needs to tip slightly more to that way, and then it's right. And then I can put a pin in there. And it's really important that you get into the habit of just squaring up your pattern pieces. The grain lines are on there to be able to help you to do that. And I really would suggest that you use your grain line, which is this double-edged arrow here, in order to make sure that everything is straight, because it just does affect the final way that the garment sits when it's finished. And if you're going to all this trouble to make something beautiful, let's get it as spot on as we can. So I'm just putting some pins in now just to hold the fabric onto the pattern piece onto the fabric, and then I'm going to go ahead with my scissors and just cut round these, and then we'll be ready to get started. So what we also have to do is we also have to cut out a copy of this for the lining, because the pattern on the front says cut 2 and on the back says cut 4. Now my only thing is that this fabric is really delicate, but those little pink flowers I think are going to show through when we actually, if we use this fabric as a lining, and I do think that it might just show through and cause a problem. So if that doesn't bother you, then don't worry, just use the same fabric again as your lining. But because I've got some of my original fabric for the dress left over, I'm actually going to cut my lining out of this fabric, because that will also, this one's a little bit lighter, that will also give some more body on the bodice, but I've got no fear then of the actual colours of the printing showing through, and that's something you can do. You might have fabric left over from the kit, or you might also have fabric in your stash that you can use, but we're just going to do this with mine today, and I hope that that sort of shows you why we're doing what I'm doing. So then let's just measure this out again so that we can pop the fabric down exactly the same way as we did for our top layer. We don't need to worry about the skirt, because the skirt and the ruffle isn't lined, so it's not a problem at all for that. So it's just for the bodice that we need to be able to do that, and that's why I say saving you scraps of fabric is really good sometimes, just to be able to help you do that. So let's pop that first piece on that fold line again, so it's absolutely straight on there and straight on the bottom here. And then let's pop our back piece on. I'll put it straight on the bottom, and then we'll go ahead and we will measure where this hits on the side one here. So let's just move that across 5 inches, go to the top of the line, and it's just over 5 inches, so I know it needs just to twist in just slightly. That's it, we've got it now. So that's all nice and straight. So let's pop our pins in now on the back as well, bodice back, and then we'll cut this out, and that will then give us this beautiful garment that we're sewing. Okay, so once we've finished, we can take our pattern pieces off. Make sure you keep those nice and safe, and the best place for those is actually inside your box. That's where I keep all of mine. And then we'll see that we've got the two bodice fronts, our outer and our lining, and then we've got the two bodice backs there, and then we've got the light for the front and for the top of the fabric in floral, and then we've got the two in the plain white here as well. So your fabric may well be the same and you may have the same copied across, and that's absolutely fine, but as I say, I just wanted to use the white inside mine, and if you've got enough, if you're following the kit, hopefully you've got enough fabric to be able to do the same. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do now is we are going to join the fronts and our backs. Let's just put our lining to one side because we're going to do exactly the same as that as we do with the front. So we're going to take our lining and we're going to be sewing our side seams together. So we're going to have it looking like this. So this is our neck edge on the front, and then by sort of crossing over, so I've had the fronts here and I've just crossed them over this way, look, change direction, and then we're going to pop those onto each of the side of the front, and that will give us two arm side here and then our neck edge here. So let's just fold that across onto the top. I'm going to match the underarm seam. Oh, squeaky chair still, I've not managed to fix that yet, so I do apologise. I don't notice it when I'm talking, but apologies to you if it does drive you nuts. And then on this side we're going to fold this one over as well. And again, we're putting 2 pins in because I don't want that fabric to twist on me. If we just put 1 pin in the middle, like that, then when we're taking it to the sewing machine, if we get distracted, sometimes it can twist on us. So I would always recommend that you have your 2 pins, one either side, one at the start and one at the stop, and that will then make sure that your fabric stays nice and still for you. So let's just do the same with the lining, because we're going to do exactly the same with the lining. We might as well sew it all at front. As there's our lining front, here's one back, and here's the other back. So match those seams there. I'm just going to pop that on top just there, and then put a couple of pins in just to be able to hold that together. And then on the other side, let's take the other one, just fold it over, and it's just a short seam we're doing just down here. Make sure that all lines up nicely, and then we're going to just pop a couple of pins in there just to hold that together. Oops, give your pins a twist if they don't go through first time. Then we're going to take this to the sewing machine, and we're going to sew these 4 seams, 1, 2, 3, 4 on our sewing machine. Okay, so I've got my machine set up with my coordinating thread, and we're just going to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance down this side first. So a couple of stitches forward, a couple of stitches back, and then needling the work. I'm going to take out the first pin and carry along. Just stop to take your pins out so it doesn't pull your fabric, and then just reverse. Take that out, or you can carry on if you want to, but sometimes with these shaped seams it's a little difficult to carry on and to chain stitch them. Couple of stitches back, needling the work, pin out. And we want the seam allowances to be the same on the lining and on the outer, because when these come together we want them to match perfectly. So just repeat the same on your lining fabric, and then you'll end up with your bodice sewn together in this way, and then we're just going to finger press these seams open. Just to hold those open, that'll be enough for now. You can press it if you want to, but finger pressing will probably be enough. Okay, I'm just going to sew my lining and then we'll carry on. Okay, so I'm just going to finger press the seams open on my bodice lining. It's all nice and even. Oops, if I can separate the seams out. That's it. And then what I'm going to do now is lay my floral bodice face side up, and then my lining is going to go right side down, and that's going to match on the top there. And what we're going to do is going to use our pins. Let's match the underarm seams first. So make sure they're right on top of each other, and then pop a pin in to hold that. Let's make sure the bodice front is right on top of each other as well. And let's pop a pin at the centre front there, just to get everything all nice and lined up. Just give your pin a twist if it won't go through your fabric first off. And then let's match the underarm seams at this point as well here. The other one. Oops. little fine fabrics, aren't they? I don't always want to cooperate. Make sure your seam allowances are open. Him's not quite right, okay. That's it. And then we're going to go onto the back here, and we're going to make sure that the centre backs, the two sides of the centre back match as well. Just a pin there. Let's put this one on to make sure that's all nice and straight. And because we've cut these from the same pattern, then everything should match up, and down to the bottom of the bodice back. So you're trying to sort of match some match points first, I suppose, really, just to make sure that everything's going to be right. And then we can put a pin in order to hold the straps, if you like, the shoulder points of the bodice together. We might have to move some of these out of the way whilst we're sewing, but for now it'll just keep everything in the right place for when we start to stitch this together. There's one more there. Put another one on that one, just this one here. Okay, let me just have a quick look on my pattern. Yeah, so we're going to start at the straight edge here, and we're going to, well, it's going to be upside down, isn't it? We're going to sew along here to the edge here. We're going to pivot at this point, round the neck, across the shoulder, down around the arm and up again, across the top of the shoulder again, down and round the front here, across, down and round again here, across, round the back of the neck and back down to the waist seam just here. So it's quite a long amount of stitching, but it's going to put it all together for us and make it look really nice. So let me just get our machine together. I'm just using a straight stitch, and it'll just be 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm turning it up so I've got the flat edge to start on. So that's nice. Line your fabric up so you're going to have your 1/4 inch. Take that first pin out. And then this is going to be really important to do what's called pivoting, which is where you leave your needle in the work and then you can twist your fabric. And if I've got a natty function on mine where I can press a button and my needle goes in my work, and when I start sewing, my needle always finishes in my work. It's on most computerised machines, but it's not on the manual machines. If you're on a manual machine, then what you'll need to do is, let me just move the camera, is to use your hand crank on the end here, and you can move your needle up or down. So when you want to pivot, you're going to move your hand crank to put that needle in the work before you then start to move your fabric or turn your corner, and that will help you then to get everything all nice and neat. Okay, let me turn the thing round. You'll see what I mean about the pivoting, and we've done it before, so you are familiar with it, hopefully. But if you've just jumped into this one video, then you'll need to know what I'm talking about. So because I've gone forward, let me just take a couple of stitches back just to sort of seal that and knot that thread, and then we're just going to carry on now up to the top of this edge, straight edge just here. So I leave the pin in until the last minute, and then when I feel it getting in the way, I'm going to take that out, and we're going to stop 1/4 inch from the top of this seam just here. Needle in the work, and then we leave the needle in the work, we lift up the presser foot. Now we can turn our fabric and we won't lose our place. So now we're going to line up the back of the neck with the 1/4 inch seam allowance, and we're going to follow the edge of the fabric here. And I can see we're starting to go off the curve because the fabric is coming out here. My presser foot wants to carry straight on. So leave the needle in the work, lift the presser foot and just turn the fabric slightly. And sometimes you only can do a couple of stitches at a time, and that's fine. It's just wanting to give that lovely smooth curve all the way up to the top of this shoulder point. I'm going to leave the needle in the work, lift up the presser foot again, and now we can nip across the top of this shoulder point. Again, about 1/4 inch away, and you can mark that if you want to, but you'll be able to eyeball it after a bit. And then lift the presser foot up again, and we're going to go down this side here. So again, just be aware of how your curve is forming so that you don't try and sort of jump it and make it a bit more straight than it should be, because you need those curves in order for it to fit round Lillian's body properly. So I can see my fabric starting to bunch, so needle in the work, change direction, do a few more stitches, and then we can then start to change direction again for going around the bottom of this curve. And that's quite steep, so we will be doing quite a few manoeuvres around the bottom of this line here. We're close, let me take that pin out. So along the bottom here, do a few stitches on the bottom, and then we're going to start turning up the other side here. So literally we're just going to keep manipulating this fabric around. Just watch out for your pins. Let's move that one up there. I'll be able to get a bit closer before I take that one out, because we're going to need to have the pins in and to be able to see where we are. So around the top here, up to the top of this arm, and then twist again. And this way you just don't get any pressure on your fabric then. You're not roughly manipulating your fabric. It's all going to sit. You can see how lovely and neat that's all sitting, and that's what you want. You want it to sit really nice and flat. So on the straight bit we can go a little bit quicker, but then when we're coming down to this section here, we're just going to go nice and slow. Let's lift that presser foot so that fabric can stay flat. Did you see how it was bunching up, and then as soon as you lift your presser foot, it releases that tension on the fabric? And again here, look, I've got a little loop lifting up here, but when I lift the presser foot, that's all going to all lie flat. Take that pin out. This is the centre front, so we want this all lovely and flat and straight and even, so both sides are even as well around the edge. And I've got this side just here. Take the pin out when you can. I'm going to pivot again at the top edge here. Take this pin out now and there. Right, I'm going to finish this off because this is just going to finish off the same, and I'm going to finish at this bottom edge here just by following this edge, and I'm just going to reverse at the bottom. This long flat edge here, we don't sew. That's where the skirt has to fit in. So don't sew that closed. Just finish at the bottom of the centre back, which is the bottom of this long straight edge just here. Okay. Okay, so let's just have a look at this again, and hopefully you can see my stitches along here. So we start at this flat edge, across the back, across the shoulder, round the arm side, around the front of the pinafore, around the second arm side, across the shoulder, around the back of the neck, and then down the straight edge. And as I said, this long edge along the bottom here has been left open because that's where we're going to put our gathers for our skirt at the end. But before we turn this round, we need to just do a little bit of prep. So what we're going to do is we're going to look for our right angles, so at the top of the shoulders and also down the back, or those angles, and we're just going to trim off that fabric just slightly wider than 1/4 of an inch of 45 degrees. But you're going to go up to, but not through the stitches. So if you can see just there, there's my stitches, and I'm just a few fibres away from that. And we're going to do that on each. We don't want to compromise the seam at all those stitches, but we need to remove some of this bulk so that these shoulders will sit nice and flat, especially because this is quite a lovely delicate fabric as well. Just taking those bits off. That's what my shoulders look like by the time I finish with those. Quite a collection of little snippets that we've got, but that's okay. This is what we have to do to get this to lie nice and flat. And then on the back here again, let's just take that off at slightly more than 45 degrees. So let me move those pieces out of the way so they're not distracting. Okay, so this is what we look like now. We've got the corners cut off these sections. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to snip into the curves. Now this is really important, and when we were making the collar on Lillian's dress, you'll remember we did that little experiment where we worked out whether it was better to snip or not, and hopefully you agreed with me that it was better to snip. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take our snips and we're just going to cut into the seam allowance, but we're not going to go through our stitches. So where it's flatter, you don't need to do so many snips, but when it's more curved, we need more. Can you see those along the top there? Hopefully. And then so we've got a nice big curvy edge here, so these are going to be quite close together. So we're going to snip quite close together down these arms. This is around the arm side. Just make sure you do one at the bottom as well. And this will just help everything just lie really flat. It's not one of those steps that you can miss and think, oh, it doesn't matter. It really does matter. So that's got that all done. If you accidentally snip through your stitches, just put it back in your machine and just sew another row of stitches just a hair's breadth into the bodice around the section that you've done. Just join your stitches and then sew on a few stitches past, and that will then make sure that that sits all nicely for you. Again, around the neckline we're going to do the same. So we're going to do those same snips around this neckline and then around here. So you're going to snip the back of the neck, around the arm, around the neck, around that arm side, and then the back of the neck here as well, and then I'll meet you back here and we'll turn this round. Okay, so the next thing then that we're going to do now is we are going to turn around these this bodice, and you're going to see that you just have to just push into those sections. So I'm just roughly just pushing them in at the moment just to get them started, in order that we've got everything all turned round. And then what I'm going to do is take a pin, one that I've bent previously, doing exactly the same thing, and then you can either use a chopstick or a crochet hook or a turning tool, whatever you've got. And then we're just going to go into these sections here where we've got, this is the centre back at the moment. And you're just going to encourage that fabric out so that it's going to give you the shape of the bodice that we've just sewn. So we know we need to be flat on these shoulder points so that they can be joined together. So let's make sure. And you want to sort of pull it out so that you can see the stitches in the gap just there. So if you can't see the stitches, you've not pulled it out far enough. And we want it to be really on the edge of the body so that we keep to the originally intended size that we wanted. So let's just pull out all these little corners. It's going to take you just a few moments to do this, so don't try and rush this, because if you try and rush it, you'll end up pulling on your fibres, and then that will then cause a problem, because then you'll be compromising your seams. Let's just ease these out. You see some bits come out nice and easily, and then you can just then tease out these centre little corners here until you've got everything all sorted nicely. And I know that some people have said to me before about why don't we sew the bodice in a different way so that the shoulder seams are joined, but you haven't got enough room in order to turn this round because it's so little and so delicate that you've not got enough room to be able to pull it through on the top of the shoulders. So this is the only way on these small garments that I would suggest you can do it. And I've done it before and it looks really nice, and most of the stitching on those shoulder points is covered by the collar, so it won't be a problem at all. And we'll do some lovely little delicate stitches when it comes to that stage, but we're not there yet, so don't worry. We're going to attach the skirt first whilst it's in the flat. So I'm just going to carry on just teasing these shoulder points out. So you don't need to watch me do this, you know what I'm doing, and then I will then come back to you and we'll talk about how to make sure that this is all going to sit nice and flat, and we'll give it a press as well. Okay, so I've pulled all of mine round, but what I've noticed is that some of it isn't wanting to sit quite flat. Now, some of it will do when we press it, but also what it can mean is round the front here, can you see I've got some little light pulls around here? What it can mean is that your snips are not close enough together. So if you just go back in again and just put a few more snips on the edges in between where you've already snipped, making sure not to snip through anything you don't want to snip through. This fabric is quite precious, isn't it? Then when we come to actually pop this down again on the work surface, then this should then lie flatter than it was doing. So just snips do need to be quite close together. So mine have gone from being sort of like that distance apart to being this distance apart, because now when I pop this down, you don't need to go right up into the straight edges of your straps. It's just around this front bit. I can see already that that is lying flatter for me. And so rather than press those creases in, it will actually mean that that will just stretch that out and it will just sit nice and neatly for me when we do go to press it. So I am going to put a few more snips in mine just to make sure that's going to sit right. And then meet me back here with your iron, because we're just going to press this on our pressing mat and make sure that that's all lovely. The other thing that we want to do is just make sure that our shoulders are going to fit together nicely as well, because we're going to stitch those together afterwards, and make sure they're that's where you want to have kept your 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, in order that that's going to make the armhole for you when you join that section to there and that section to there. Okay, let me just get this all re-snipped a little bit more, but that's good because it's all fixable, and then I'll come back to you because I need my arms to lie a little flatter before I start to press this. Okay, so I've got my wool pressing mat in place, and I've got my lovely bodice all lined up, ready to go. Everything's sitting much flatter, and I'm much happier with that now, just taking that extra time just to go in and just to reiterate those just re-snip those edges. So now we're just going to make sure everything's all lying all flat. We're then going to cover the bodice with a press cloth, and then we're going to press this. I'm using a pressing down motion rather than a moving motion, because we don't want these two layers to move against each other. We just want to actually press those seams into place. And this bodice size is too small. You know, on the dress we use that understitching technique. Then I do think that this fabric is too small to do that, and I think that if we press it well enough, perhaps once that way and then press it this way round, the other way round as well, that I think that this will stay in place enough that we don't need to worry about that technique. But normally, as you know, I'm a big fan of that. So once we've got our bodice finished, I've got a couple of little steps here, and I'm just going to smooth those off because I want that to be lovely and smooth, just with the cutting out, just evening that up, just take a little smidge off the edge just to make that nice and neat. And then I'm going to leave this like it is now, just flat, because we don't want to join these sleeves at the moment, because it'll make it a little bit trickier for joining the skirt on, and we can do that as part of the finishing touches when we've got some hand stitching to do. So for now we're going to put this bodice out of the way. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to take our 2 strips of our fabric, our long strips of fabric. This is a 3 inches by the 44 inches that we did, and we've taken the selvage edges off the end. And before we sew it into one long strip, let's just press the end of it up, shall we? And that will just work very nicely for us. So I'm just going to press up. This is going to be for the bottom hem. Press up 1/4 of an inch. Can use your pins as well, as you know that I'm a fan of using pins, so you can measure it up if you want to, but on this it's not so essential to be, well, it is essential to be accurate, isn't it? But because I've been doing it a long time, then I kind of know what my 1/4 of an inch is. So I've turned it up once, but use your pins if you need to, and then just press in between your pins. You'll have seen me do this on the bottom of the dress already that we've already made, and then just pin again, press again, and then turn over for a second time, pop your pin in. This is going to give you a lovely edge. And doing a double hem like this as well will help your dress give it some stiffness on that hem, so it helps with that illusion of volume as well. And then once you've done that, then take that out, and then just give it another press, and you'll be ended up with the lovely neat hem on the bottom of here. Now I haven't joined my 2 strips together yet. I'm going to press them first like this, because then we can fold them out, and I'll show you how to do a French seam on the bottom of this so that we hide that join and there's no fraying on the edge of that at all. So go ahead and do this on the bottom of the 2 3-inch strips that you've got. Leave your 5.5 inch strip. You don't need to do anything to that just at the moment. Okay, so once you've got your 2 strips with your bottom hem folded double like this, the first thing we're going to do is join this into one so we can have one continuous hem all the way around. Now I've just thought of something, hold on. I'm going to make you change something. Because on the front of, right, if we sew these 2 pieces of fabric together, we're going to end up with a join on the centre front of the dress just here, because both strips will be equal in length and they'll meet at a point here centrally on the dress. And that's something that's going to throw my eye off. So what I'm going to suggest that we do is that we cut one of these strips in half in order that we end up with side seams with without that centre front seam. We're going to end up with a seam either side at the back here. Yeah, for me that's going to be better with my eye, I think. Hold on a second. Okay, sorry about that. I was just checking with the instruction and having a look at the details, because there's two things. If you want your skirt, so this is your 5.5 inch strip, if you want your skirt to be open at the back, then you will need to do this next step, and you'll need to cut that second strip in half. If you want to have your skirt in the round, so let me just get Lillian. So where you've got a swan join at the centre back and that the pinafore sits over the back. But what you will do is make sure that your strip, when you put it on, you make sure that you've got a side seam, a seam at each side here, rather than having a seam at the centre front and the centre back. I hope that makes sense. It's just an aesthetic thing that I think some people would do automatically, but if you're a beginner, then you may not think about that. But what we don't want to have that join of these two fabrics sitting right centre front here on the skirt. We want to move it to the side seams. So make that decision now as to whether you want your pinafore skirt to be open at the back and have you know, be two separate pieces, because that's perfectly feasible, or if you want to do it as Claire's done it in the instructions, where it will be sewn together like this skirt here. I'm going to sew mine separately, because then that'll show you a new technique of how to finish off this back and have it sewn separately. If you want to have your skirt so that it's joined on the back here, you'll just do exactly the same as you did on the back of this skirt. And so you've got the instructions in the previous video. Sorry about confusing you, but sometimes you've got these design choices, and so it is important to see what to do. So let me have a look. So on here, I've put the raw edges of one of the strips together to each other, and that's given me a folded edge down at this end here. And as long as they're on top of each other perfectly, which they are, then I'm just going to use my scissors or my snips, and I'm just going to snip through this edge here. So that now has given me, I'm going to put the main skirt piece away, so that has now given me one long strip and then these two half strips. And I'm going to join a half strip onto the end of each long strip. So just roughly pin those at the moment, just so you don't get mixed up. So just put a pin through, find the other end of your long strip, and then just put a pin through to hold on to this just for the moment. I'm not matching it up, as you can see, because it's just roughly pinned. So I've got a short strip here to cut to there. Then I've got my long strip, which is double the width of the other piece. And then I've got another short strip on the other end. Okay, that's because I'm going to have my skirt open at the back, my pinafore. Right, so then with this section here, what I'm going to do now, I'm going to work one section at a time. I'm going to take the pin out, and then I'm going to unfold the edges that we've just pressed, just for the moment. But I'm going to put this fabric so that the right sides are out. So I'm just turning it round. So you can see the two ironed edges are together here with those folds in. I'll show you more closely in a minute, but make sure they fold out. And this is called a French seam that we're doing now. And with a French seam, you always start with your wrong sides of your fabric together and your right sides out, which feels wrong at first, but you'll see what we'll do with it. It gives a really nice clean finish. Okay, so we've pinned that, and you can see I've folded out the edges where those are folded. So you can see the fold lines on this side, and you can see the fold lines on the other, because we want that hem that we've ironed in to be continuous along the bottom. What you're going to do then is take this to the sewing machine, and we're going to sew at just under 1/4 inch seam allowance. It doesn't matter too much on ruffles like this, but if you, for the accuracy, but probably about 1/8 inch in. But sometimes it's difficult on machines because it wants to suck the fabric down. So if you need to do a 1/4 inch seam allowance, then do a 1/4 inch seam allowance and just trim it off. That's not a problem. So a couple of stitches forward, a couple of stitches back, and then let's put the needle in the work. Take the first pin out, and then we're going to sew to the end. and then reverse at the top again. I just wanted to bunch my fabric up slightly, but we'll smooth that out. So let's take our threads off. And so if you're doing a few, you could go ahead and do the same section. Now, can you see you've got these whiskers flicking out? We don't want those. So we're going to take our lovely, I've got my little embroidery scissors here, which are great. And I'm going to trim this seam down to half of its width so that it's only very, very small in width. Can you see how much I'm taking off? Oops. Try and make it nice and even all the way down, because that will help you when you do this next stage. And then what you're going to do now is you're going to open your fabric out on your seam, and you're just going to push that seam allowance with your fingernails to one side and do a finger press on there. You want that seam to be open with both seam allowances going to one side, and then you're going to fold your fabric over, and you're going to look for where your stitch line is, and you're going to fold your fabric exactly on that stitch line again. And then we're going to sew again with 1/4 inch seam allowance down here. So let me show you this again. So we put the wrong sides together and we sewed a narrow seam joining these two strips. We've then snipped it down a bit in order to make it smaller and make sure there's no whiskers sticking out on the end here. We then fold the fabric round so that we've got the right sides together now, and we fold it right on the edge of that seam that we've just sewn. And we're going to put it back in the machine now, and we're going to sew it at, well, it can be just under 1/4 inch, but you know, around 1/4 inch. Reverse at the start and stop again. Just use your threads to pull through if you need to, and then reverse at the end again. So this is called a French seam. It's nice and strong and it's fabulous on delicate fabrics. But what it also does, it means that when we then straighten this out and we can press that seam towards the smaller bit with our finger press, look how nice and neat, all that raw edge is all enclosed, we've got no zigzag edge sticking out, and it makes it really, really nice and neat. So I'm now going to go ahead and do the same on the other join that we just roughly pinned together, in order that this is now one long continuous strip of fabric. So do the same on yours and then we'll move on. There we go, we've got those two lovely French seams now in those two joining places, and we've got one long continuous strip that will go around the front of the dress. Just a little side note is that when you sew your second pass at that seam on your French seam, just turn it back round the right way. Just make sure you've got no whiskers showing through, or you've got none of your other fabric showing through, because that can really just make it look untidy. I've got one just there, but because then what you have to do then is you have to go in really close to the seam and just give it a little snip and snip it off. So that's why when we've done the first pass of sewing, we then trim off any whiskers and trim that seam allowance down, so that when we make the second pass, the idea is that we don't see any of the raw edges poking through to the right side on the bottom here. Okay, once we've done that, what we're going to do then is we're going to press these seam allowances out to the side, and then we're just going to reinstate those edges so that we can just press it with your fingers so that it's going to fold over. So I'm just reinstating now that we've just pressed that, sewn that seam, just to make sure that's going to be okay. And then we're going to load into our sewing machine and we're going to sew this bottom hem shut. So again, just line up, move your needle if you need to. So I'm going to move mine across from the 3.5 position stage a couple of clicks in order to make sure that's going to sit nicely. There's no lace on this bottom edge, so it is just a double hem. Oops, sorry, I was off camera, wasn't I? So I've just loaded in my machine. I've got a mark on my presser foot that I'm going to follow with the end of the bottom of the skirt, the bottom hem. And then I've got moved my needle so that it's into my 1/4 inch seam allowance for my double hem here. And I'm now just going to hold on to the ends just as this gets started. A couple of stitches forward, a couple of stitches back. And then following along the edge, just nice and steady. And by just keeping your fingers and a bit of pressure on you, this strip should just flow through quite nicely for you. And it'll follow nicely until you get to that seam that we've just sewn. If you've got any long threads that are just poking out, just take those off so that they don't show through on the bottom hem, or you can just tuck them through into your hem as you're going. Again, it's all just about finishing that really neatly. And do a bit and stop, and then do a bit more. And stop. It's all about the controlled sewing to make sure you can zoom it, but it won't be as neat. Just take your time when you're coming up to your join. And then where you've got your join, just tuck it under with your fingers. Just make sure that seam allowance is pointing towards the start for this first one, and then it'll point towards the back for the second one. And if you need to, you can just take a little pin. I've got a thread there. Just poke that thread in with the pin, and it doesn't want to go. Come on. Slip it off if it's not cooperating. It's easier to do them as you go along than it is to try and go back and pin them. So I'm going to refold that hem, and I'm going to hold on to my fabric at the back and at the front just to help ease this bump through. Nice and steady just there. Can you hear it struggling a little bit? It's over the worst of it, and then we're out the other side. And remember to put your needle in your work just to hold your place as you're readjusting your fabric. Okay, so we're just going to carry on and sew that whole hem down the whole length of your fabric. And so when we're finished, we've got one continuous strip now with a nearly invisible join on that side edge that's going to look lovely for our dress. Take off any loose threads that you've got anyway. The fabric does sometimes just pick them up, but your hem should look nice and neat in the same distance from the hem edge all the way along. Okay, the next thing that we're going to do now is we're going to work with both of the skirts. We're going to work with this frill, which is very long now, and we're going to work with the other skirt, the 5.5 inch strip, because we're going to put some gathering stitches in. So the next stage that I would suggest is that you take out your coordinating thread and add in a contrast thread of some sort, or just a different colour where you can see the difference between the two threads, because it does mean then that you don't actually that you do actually know which threads to take out with your gathering. So it doesn't take long just to rethread your machine. And if you just do the same with yours, and I'm putting this red that I used before, and that worked very well for me before. So let's just pick up that bobbin thread and we're ready to go. Okay, so if you've got a machine where it cuts off the ends, you need to make sure you've got your ends, because we're going to need those for gathering. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take the same strip we've just been working on, but let's put it right sides up now, and then you're going to be working on the opposite edge to the hem that we've just done. And so on your raw edge here, and we're going to put 2 rows of gathering stitches. So the first row has to be less than 1/4 inch, and the next row has to be more than 1/4 inch. So let's just, another thing, let's take our stitch length up to a 3, and let's take it up 3.5 actually, and let's loosen off our tension. So you should have a tension dial on your machine as well. Oops, can't get you to see mine. A tension dial, and we want to take that down. I take that down to about a 1.5 in order that loosens off the stitch tightness so that we can gather that up. So we don't reverse at the start and stop, we just sew along from the start. I'm just going to feed all of this strip through. And if you notice, I haven't neatened this top raw edge at the moment, because if we neaten it too soon, it's going to be too bulky on the back of the dress, but we'll neaten it at the end. So don't worry, I've not forgotten. When you come to your seam allowances, make sure that they are pointing away from the long strip. So you want them to point into the shorter strip. Come to the end, remember to leave some threads to pull on, and then you're going to go right back to the beginning of your strip, and you're going to now sew it the same way with the stitch at more than, which I'm 3.5 again, at more than your 1/4 inch, so that you've got a nice room of margin for gathering and stowing this together. When you finish, you've got 2 rows of stitching opposite end to your hemmed edge, and you've left, oops, go back to the beginning, you've left some threads, long threads on both at the start and at the stop at the end of at both ends of these both rows of the stitching. Sorry, my words are going funny. Okay, so then we're going to take our long strip, then our 5.5 inch strip, and we're going to put these 2 lines in at the top again on here. So just choose one, because the fabric is two directional, so it doesn't really matter on this floral. Just make sure that if you've got a one directional fabric where your flowers are all standing one way and all your stems are going the other way, make sure that you're doing this on the right end, so that this is going to be at the waist seam that we're going to be gathering this. So wherever you want your waist to be and your flowers to fall, so if there was a face, that's the best way of looking at it. If it was a face, you'd want your face to be up, and you do this top edge here. I know we're talking about florals, and not trying to confuse you, but if your pattern was printed with a direct, let's say like it was a face, and it could only be one way up, and if you had it that way up it would be the wrong way, make sure that when you feed your fabric through, you're doing it at the top end, and that your patterns when you finish with the waist aren't going to be upside down. It's called having a directional print, but on florals generally you're okay, and they can be worked either way, but just give your fabric a good looking at in order to make sure that you're happy with which way round it is. And then when you're ready, you're just going to do the same thing again, and along the one edge of the top you're going to leave your long ends first, and then you're going to do your first row of stitches all the way along. You're going to leave some ends at the end, and then you're going to put it back in again, and you're going to put your second row of your gathering stitches in as well. Okay, once you've finished putting those 2 rows in the top of your 5.5 inch strip, then we can just fold that up and put that out the way. We're not working with that just at the moment. We just need to pop that one out the way. But what we will be doing is working with our other strip. And what we're going to do first of all, we've got this on mine, because we've got these edges marked, then I know where my back is, but for you, you might have yours joined together all as one. And what we need to do is on those long strips is we just need to put a pin in to mark that centre point. So I've got this orange pin here that will do for me. So I've just folded my fabric in half, and I've got the pin going to mark that halfway point. So my 2 French seams are on top of each other. I've smoothed the fabric along, and on that long strip we've just marked that halfway point with a pin, just so that we know when we're attaching this onto the dress. All we're going to do now is we are going to take the 2 bobbin threads, because remember they gather up more easily, separate them out from the top threads. So you can see, so I've got my two top threads and 2 bobbin threads, and then wrap them around your fingers, hold on to your fabric, and then you'll be able to start and gather this fabric up towards the side seam. And I would gather it up towards the side seam, but I wouldn't go any further than that. So the 2 short lengths, gather those up first into each other. Again, at this moment in time, we've not marked up our skirt to say how far we want this to go yet, but we will do in a minute. So just start the gathering process is what I'm saying. You can see how that lovely ruffle's all starting to come together. Then I'd go to the other end, separate out your bobbin threads from your top threads again. They get tangled around each other. Just undo a stitch if you need to, so that you can clearly separate those out together. And then again, hold on to your bobbin threads, and then just pull your fabric along those threads, not too roughly, so you don't want to snap the fabric or the threads. And you're going to take that along. You can see it's starting to fray a little bit, but we'll deal with that in a minute. We're going to gather this roughly up to that halfway, to that little side seam that we did, the little French seam that we did earlier. Then I'm going to find my pin on the centre section here, and being very careful, you just go one side of your pin or the other and just pull on one thread and just loosen it off, put something, pin or your little nose of your scissors through, but I'm not cutting the thread, I'm just wanting to lift it so to get these little loops. See those little loops? So that then I can put something through it, and then I can pull on those loops gently, and they'll start to gather. Once I've started them gathering, then I can discard my scissors, and then making sure that we're doing one side at a time. Just a little bit fiddly, just get your fingers in those edges. You don't want to cut your threads, or because if you do that, you might end up with a bold patch or a flat patch in the middle, and we don't want that. We want it to look seamless. So then I'm going to pull on one side of the threads and pull that towards this side seam here. So I'm trying not to gather it all in one long thread, because that puts too much pressure on the thread, and then you're more liable for it to snap. So move your gathers down along here. And it's always the same when you're working with anything roughly. You've got these long pieces that you've got to gather up, but it's so rewarding and it looks so lovely when it's finished. It really is worth it. So you're just trying to move those all those ruffles along, just smooth them along. Then we've worked out to that side seam, and we're going to use those same threads and pull on the other side of them, and then that will start to gather up towards the other side seam. So we're gathering all of these in away from the centre front and towards the side seams, and away from the centre back as well towards the side seams. And because we just carried it on at one long thread, then we can see where we are. Okay, so we've now got this snake of gathered fabric ruffled up. What we're going to do now is we're going to go to our piece of fabric here, and what I want to do is put the two cut edges together, because we're going to find our middle point. And I'm not working on the side with my tram lines for my gathering. I've just got my fabric upside down at the moment. I'm just finding that centre point, and we're going to just put a pin there. And then we want to find the quarter point. So now I'm going to take the raw edges, the cut edges, to the folded edge, and that's going to show me in here. I can just put my finger through there just to separate this out, so we know where it is. So now we can separate out through the fabric and just put our quarter points in. So when I open this out, I've got my two cut edges here, and then when I open this out, I've got a quarter point marked, halfway point, and when you fold your quarter points in, you should be there or thereabouts to that centre point, and again on this side here, there or thereabouts into that centre point there. Slightly off, but it's not enough to make a difference for me, so that's fine. But that's the process that we should be able to do that. Do you know what, I'm going to move them it's just a double check really. That's got that one on there. So the the cut edges go into the centre point, and then you can just measure that to make sure that's right. Okay. Now we've got some lace to attach to this long edge here, and I've got my lace from out of the kit. Let's just make sure this is going to be long enough before we even start. So I might do mine afterwards. Oh, I keep changing everything. I'm sorry, folks. I know it makes it confusing for you, but I just think it's sometimes easier to do things a slightly different way. So I'm just measuring this just roughly, just by running it along the fabric. Oh, it's not quite long enough. That's because we had that extra, didn't we? The pattern says to cut 32 inches, didn't it? And I left my fabric longer. Right. How we resolve that? Yours might be fine if you cut yours to exactly 32 inches. Just measure your lace along and just make sure that you've got enough to be able to go along your one of the straight edges of the 5.5 inch. I'm going to sew mine on afterwards, but I do need to make sure that there's enough. Okay, so what I'm going to do is where my lace finishes, I will then cut my fabric there, and then on here I'll just undo some stitches here, some threads, so that I can pull it through. So let me just do that now. Where's my quick and pick? So what I'm going to do, I hope you understand what I'm trying to do. I hope that makes sense. I'm just going to unpick these threads. Let's do it on the bobbin side because I think it'll be easier. And I'm just going to unpick some of my stitches of my gathering, because that will give me the long edge that I need to be able to gather this fabric up. If you cut your piece of fabric exactly 32 inches, then your lace should fit for you. Okay, so at the end I've just undone some of the gathering stitches, so I've still got my long legs of length of my ends, and then with my, when I attach the lace onto the bottom of my skirt like this. I just need to take a little bit more off. Let me just put a pin in where that is. Just take out a few more stitches, because that will then mean that we can carry on. I'm just going to cut off this edge of this fabric. So when you've got your quarter places marked, you can just double check those by making sure that when you fold them into the centre and put your raw edge in the centre, that your pins are on your quarter points, which mine are too, so that's fine. So that's there. And then I want you to have a look at your lace. If you've got the same lace as me, I'm going to suggest that you wait until we've attached the ruffle to sew this lace on. And the reason is that this edge here, which is beautiful and decorative, is going to be quite clunky for your machine to go through when you're attaching, and you're going to lose some of that detail. So it depends on how you want it to be, but for me, I'm going to attach mine afterwards. If your lace doesn't have this edge here, this sort of embroidered edge, then what you can do now is lay your lace so that you've got your right side together with your fabric, the pattern of your fabric. Lay it on, and then just run a row of stitches just inside your 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, so perhaps 1/8 of an inch, and just attach that, because what you want is that when we attach the ruffle, you want that to go over the top of the ruffle and to give you that decorative edge. I'm going to sew mine on afterwards, and I'll show you how to do that, but that's because mine's got this edge here, and if I sew mine in, I'm going to actually lose that decorative edge, and I want to keep it. So I am changing things slightly. But if not, so sew that on. Once you've sewn your lace on, you can come back to this stage, because this will all be the same anyway. So what you're going to do now is going to take your ruffle. You're going to find your starting point, and you're going to match that to one raw edge. So I've got my skirt panel upside down. These are my gathering stitches for my waist. And I'm going to start and pin the ruffle on. And I'm putting my pin heads outside, so off the ruffle. Can you see my pin head just here? Because if you put it down here, it gets buried in your ruffles. Then we're going to look for our first French seam that we've joined that ruffle to get that strip together, and I'm going to put that on a 1/4 point and readjust that pin just so that that's holding it on that 1/4 point. I'm then going to come to the next pin, which is going to be my halfway point, and that's going to match up with the halfway point on the skirt. Take one of the pins out and just replace one of them, that's it. And then unfolding the fabric, look for your next French seam on the skirt, which is here, and that is then going to match up with your last 1/4 pin. So I haven't worried about the ruffles just yet, we've not adjusted them, we're just getting that spacing correct first. So let's go through that, and then let's go back to the end where we were. We're going to have lots of threads all over the place, don't worry about that. And the ruffles go in right sides together with the skirt as well, perhaps didn't say that. And then put a pin at the end here as well, just to hold that together. So when you look at it, you can see we've got this like the loops of the ruffle is loose, but we've anchored it at the start and at the stop, and then the seam is on the 1/4 point. We've matched up the halfway point on both the ruffle and the skirt, and this is to make sure that you get the same amount of ruffles in each section of your skirt. Then what we can do, let's go on to this first bit here, is we then sort of have a look at it, and that's not bad, is it really? This isn't too much longer than the ruffles than the skirt length. So we want to get these two pieces of fabric, the skirt and the ruffle, to be the same length, so that when we stitch it, it's all going to stitch together. So I start by working towards the side pins, and I'm just moving my ruffles down in order that I don't see how I've got a bunch up here. Probably can't see there. See how that's quite tightly ruffled there, and that's very loosely ruffled there. You want your ruffles to be all the same, your gathers to be about the same. It does take some experience to just get them right, but just do what you can to move that all so that it's along, and you'll find, and you're wanting to make sure that your fabric is the same length as your skirt. So keep checking it and keep adjusting it. This bit does take a little bit of time, but we can't speed it up. It's not a job that can be speeded. Just keep moving them along until you're happy that your ruffles are pretty much even all the way along, and that when you hold the two pieces of fabric together, they're the same length. So once I've done that, I'll then go to the middle of that section I'm working on, and I'll pop a pin in and make sure the head is poking out towards out of your fabric, away from your fabric, and then I split the difference again halfway along, find a place, put a pin, and then see here I've got a flat bit here, and I've got lots of gathers here, so I'm just going to gather those up, so that move those along so that we've not got that flat section. And the way that sometimes your gathers will want to come off your pins, and the way you can do it is do a figure eight. So I've got my pin in, marking it, so I've taken my threads, my gathering threads behind, and then around the point, round the top, round the point, and round the top, and that's just anchoring those threads now, so it's not going to get any longer. I can just move my gathers along in order to make sure that they're as even as possible, and I've not got a raw bit, a flat bit in the centre. And gathering is one of those things that does come with practice. So then that's how many pins I've got in there. I've got that's my seam, and that's my centre, and I've added another 3 pins in. So now let's go to the start here. So I've got start in the centre first, and now I'm going to do this section. Hold on to your gathering pins, and I can see that we're about there or thereabouts, but I'm going to hold on to my threads and just get rid of any flat spots. I've got a flat spot there, so let's move those gathers along to make it all even. And you're just going to work along in sections like this, keeping your lines of gathers straight. You don't want to start and twist it, but you want to be able to hold on to that fabric at the back there, and for everything just to sort of sit nicely and be nice and gathered. A few too many at the back edge there, so let's bring some of those forward. Flat patch there and a gathered patch there, so let's just even those out. And that's about right now. So now I can start and pin that on. So let's put a pin in the middle first. Always go to the middle first of your section you're working on, and you can just adjust any other flat spots that you've got. I am leaving a little bit of a flat spot at the very start here, and where the raw edges of the fabric are, because I want to be able to hem that at the end, and that can afford to be a little bit flatter. It doesn't matter so much about that bit. Let's move some of these along and put the pin in. Lace getting in the way, let's move that out of the way, and then to this section just here, just make sure everything's all lying nice and flat and straight. And then I can put a pin in there as well. So I'm now going to adjust the other 2 sections. I'm going to go back and do the section in towards the middle first, and then the one towards the end in exactly the same way until you've got your ruffles all pretty along here, and then we're going to take it to the sewing machine, and then we're going to sew it. Okay, so just before we sew this, just to say there's kind of 2 steps to gathering, 3 steps. You've got to put your gathering threads in, 4 steps. You've got to put your gathering steps in your fabric that's going to be ruffled. You need to quarter your fabric your straight fabric that it's going to be attached to, and then you need to then pull up your gathering threads until the 2 pieces of fabric are the same length, so that they sit flatly against each other. Once you've done that, then you can even out your gathers along those threads, and you can use that figure of 8 movement around your pins in order to make sure that your thread doesn't keep sort of going longer or shorter on you when you're trying to do that. And that will then, if you follow those 4 steps, I thought it was only 2 to start off with, but it's 4, isn't it? Then you'll be fine. And then when we've sewn this on, you'll get a lovely ruffle that you'll be really, really proud of. So the next step that we're going to do now is we're actually going to then take this to the sewing machine and we're going to be sewing. Now, because we've got these figure of 8s, we don't want to sew over those. So we're going to start our stitching first, and then we're going to undo the pin that has the figure of 8 attached and undo those threads, then carry on stitching. I'll show you what I mean as we get to them. And then that's going to neaten everything up. So let's change our thread back over to our white. And there's one very important thing that we need to remember when we are rethreading our machine after changing it, either changing the colour, or if you use your original threads, colour thread for your sewing thread, really, if you're doing your gathering stitches, is that you'll have a tension disc on your machine. Mine's just here, look. And we took it down to 1.5 in order to be able to do those gathering stitches. We need to take it back up again to well, mine's on 5, to wherever it was, so that our stitches are tight enough for when we're actually sewing the ruffle into place. Sorry if that moving the camera made anybody sick, but I just wanted to show you. So I'm going to put the flat piece of the fabric down against the machine bed. So that's going to go down here. I'm going to have the fabric in my lap, because there's quite a lot of it. And the first thing, I'm sort of holding my gathers with my finger, I'm going to take the first pin out, unusually, and I'm going to undo those figure of 8 threads first. Make sure your raw edges are still together, and then we're going to then position the fabric into that position for doing the stitch. I'm also going to take my stitch length back down to a 2.2. So make sure everything's all lined up for you. And then you can just use your fingernail to just reinstate any gathers that don't look as even. We want the raw edges of the ruffle and the skirt to be intact, and we're going to take a couple of stitches forward and a couple of stitches back, and then we're going to start and sew. We're going to put our needle in the work to hold everything intact so we can just readjust it. And you want all of your ruffle to be lying flat, so as you're going towards your ruffle, make sure nothing's folded under like that. You don't want it folded under. You want to have all of your ruffles being at a right angle to the seam that you're stitching. Just stop every now and again and just readjust. And if you need to move any ruffles, any gathers along, just regather those, or just move those on with your fingernails. And stop when you get to your pins. We don't sew over pins because it can mess up our machine. So again here, let's just make sure those ruffles are lying straight and flat. For our pin. I've got a little bit here where it's a little bit flatter, a little bit gathered. You can see it really nicely when you close up like this, and make sure all your gathers are just lying flat. Spacing of the pins is quite a nice breathing point as well, isn't it? Because you do tend to hold your breath while you're doing little bits like this. I haven't worried about all the threads that are loose at the moment. I'm just going to leave those at the moment. So all the fraying, we'll neaten that off in the end. Make sure your raw edges are together. Then I'm coming up to another pin now that's got a figure of 8 on, so I'll show you what to do with that. So keep sewing normally till you get very close to your pin. Take your pin out and then just pull out those threads to undo the figure of 8 that you did, and just have them over the top here. And then just make sure that you've got a nice neat edge, you've not got any flat pieces where those threads are. Raw edges together on your skirt and your ruffle. And then we're going to carry on sewing. And just carry on doing that all the way along. When you finish sewing, we're just going to take off the white threads, the ones that the start and the stop. This is where having different colours can help, so you don't snip off anything that you don't want to. Snip those start and stop threads off. Not for my gathering, just for the actual sewing itself. And then we're just going to have a quick look at this seam. We want to make sure that it's lying nice and flat and that there's no puckers in it anywhere, and that the fabric hasn't got folded underneath and things have gone skew-if. That's a bit of a technical term, but gone a bit wrong underneath. If they have, before you undo your gathering stitches, just go back, undo a few stitches, make it lie flat, and then just go back in again and just redo that. Okay, and then the next thing that we're going to do then is we are going to find our centre threads. We can snip those off now once we're happy that all our gathers are correct. So I just take those centre threads off, and then I'm going to go back to the end here. I'm going to use one of the threads at a time, so just one of the top thread first, and I'm just going to pull my gathers, that thread, all the way through my gathers so that it's going to take it right off the edge. It's going to go right into the middle, so keep bunching everything up. And then eventually you'll feel it just gives way, and then the thread will come out in your hand. And you can take off the other side of that one thread. That should just go through nicely. If you've managed not to sew over them, then that should come out quite nicely. Oh, it's got stuck in the middle, hasn't it? Just cut it in the middle. That's those two. And then we're going to do the same with this bottom thread again now. We're taking out the gathering stitches now because everything's as we want it to be. Okay, so when you've taken out your gathering stitches, you're going to end up with this sort of like raggy kind of edge on the end here. If you've got an overlocker, you can go straight in and you can overlock over the edge if you want to. I'll use a zigzag stitch because I think that's what most people have got. And as I'm sort of going along, I'm just going to be pulling these little threads up towards the top so that they are hanging over the edge of the zigzag stitch, and then we'll be able to neaten those off just by cutting them. We've still got the red thread in the bottom at the waist, that'll end up being the waistband. If you remember, this is how it's going to look when it's finished, but we're going to first of all neaten this edge before we do the next stage. So to do that, I'm going to pop my fabric back in again with the flat edge down against the sewing machine bed, and I'm going to choose my zigzag stitch. And I've got a 5 width and a 2 length, that'll do. So we're going to start off at the very end here, making sure that your fabric and your skirt is all to your left, and then we'll start and sew this. And as I say, I'm zigging in my fabric, but then I zag, if you like, for want of a better phrase, I zag over the edge. And let's put our needle in our work so we don't lose our place. And I'm just trying to tidy this up on the inside as we go, just with anything that doesn't want to sort of go into over the edge at the back there, we'll just clip off. This will just stop it fraying in the future for us. Have a nice deep zigzag as well, because this fabric is liable to fraying, and it will just make it neater, it'll just make it more robust. Just make sure that your zigzag stitches don't go any further than the stitch line attaching the ruffle. And if we'd have zigzagged the gathered edge before we actually attached it to the skirt, it would have caused you problems, because it would have meant that that was too thick an edge when it's all gathered up, when it's got the zigzag stitches on the end. It makes it too bulky. You're much better to attach your ruffle first and then neaten the edge afterwards. Okay, let's get a needle out the work. And then we've got to then very carefully take off our starting and stopping threads. But then we're just going to then just smooth these threads out, and where we've got the whiskers over the edge of our edge, can you see how we've got all of these threads here? We're just going to take it steady and just snip those off to give us a nice neat edge onto this. Try not to go through any of your zigzag stitches when you're doing this, because it is quite easy to get a bit carried away. We'll check the other side in a minute. Let's just worry about this top edge. And if you just pull your fingers out towards the raw edge, and it'll just loosen up anything that needs to come off for you. There's going to be quite a few because it is quite a fraying fabric, but then that's okay, we can deal with that. And then you'll see that you'll get to a point where you're not going to have any more frays. So I'm just going to go along and do that. Then when I've done that, I'm going to turn it over and just have a look on this side, and just where anything sort of got caught that's not been taken off, I'm just going to make sure that it's neat from both sides of the skirt. Yeah, so just neaten this side as well and just take off any raw edges, just trying to make it as neat as possible. Otherwise the threads will just keep shedding all the time and we don't want that. Okay, so once you've finished taking out all your gathering stitches and you've neated everything, obviously keep your gathering stitches in your waist. We need those still yet. We've not worked with those yet. But let's just take this to the ironing board and let's just press the seam allowance up into the skirt. So we want to press that up into the main skirt and make sure that that's going right on the very edge there, because we want to have that folded up so that it's going to give this lovely frill on the bottom of the skirt. As you can see how that's all starting to come out, and see how with that double hem it's giving us that really lovely dramatic undulations on the bottom here, and that's going to be nice. So try not to, when you press it, try not to, certainly don't press over your gathering stitches, don't press those. You're going to be really precise with your things. Just pull the two pieces of fabric apart, and then we're just going to then press on here. You're trying not to flatten your gather, you're just wanting to press the main body of the skirt up and away so that that seam allowance is facing up onto the back there. Let me get my press mat and I'll show you. Okay, so I'm just going to let my iron stand still for me for a minute. So I've got my gathers down towards me, I've got the wrong side of my fabric up, and then I'm just pulling the two pieces of fabric apart. So, and if you want to, you can put a pin in, so keep a pin in the waistband like that, and you could put a pin in through the hem just to keep it separate. But you're just going to just press on this edge just here. You're just wanting to keep that so that that's nice. So I'm not pressing down these ruffles here, and just on that section just there. And then when you've done that all the way along, you can fold it over, and you're just making sure that you've not sort of lost any width at all on your skirt, and that everything's all pulled up to the same level. So again, you can see I'm not pressing down this section here, I'm just pressing on that join just there. And we can move along, making sure that that seam allowance, you can feel it with your fingers, is in the right place. And then we're just going over here. I'm not going right up here to the edge here. We don't want to press over those gathering stitches, because then they will be difficult to pull up, because it'll kind of set the stitches in place, and we don't want those setting in place. So if you've already got your lace attached, you can skip this next bit if you're on this ruffle. But because I saved mine so that I was going to see this lovely decorative edge, what I want to do now is make sure I've got the right side of my lace up. I'm going to turn my skirt upside down because I work from left to right, so it depends on which way you are. But I'm going to make this bottom edge of the embroidery on the lace sit against the start of the ruffle. So once I've done that, let me just get a pin and I can pop that in place just to hold that into place. And then just smooth down the next section. So the lace is flat, it's not been gathered, it's just sitting over the top of that ruffle. But the way that I'm doing it means that we've got that lovely decorative edge that matches on the dress onto the edge here. And I'm just going to pin this all the way along. But if you just go all the way along and just pin your lace in place, oh gosh, that's another tongue twister, isn't it? But what I'm going to try and achieve, if I just get this pin in, is that the bottom decorative edge is hiding hiding that seam where the ruffles have been added. So I'm trying to not have the lace up here and then you see the seam below. I'm trying to get it so that the lace covers exactly right on where that join is, so that it hides it. That's the theory. So let's go to our machine, check which stitch we're on. We're on a zigzag, so let's take it back down to a straight stitch. And obviously you're not going to do this until you've pinned all of yours. Make sure that you're pinning your seam allowance up into your skirt, because we're going to catch that down at the same time. Start yourself off. Let's put our needle in place. Make sure that's where it needs to be, and then we're going to take a couple of stitches forward and a couple of stitches back just to start us off, and then pop your needle in the work. And then I've got my fabric and I can see where the lace is going to fall, and then as I get close to my pin, then I can pull my pin out and you can see to get that edge right in place. If you've got a speed control on your machine, then just turn that down so that you're going nice and slow, and you will be catching, as I said, the seam allowance for your ruffle up at the same time. So take your pins out as you go, reposition. I'm just going to go all the way down and just attach that, and then we'll have a look at it once it's completed. So there we go, that's the lace attached, and actually the stitching is almost invisible. Okay, the other thing that I want to do now is just on your end of your lace, just attach those square with the edge of your ruffle. So just pull your lace across, and just within what will be the seam allowance, just put a few stitches just to hold that lace down. Just need a few, because that will help that in the next stage, because for me, I'm going to neaten this back edge of this skirt. Am I going to? Yes, I am. Questioning myself. But we're just going to make sure that this section of the lace doesn't come up or get flicked up. Just going into the back there. So that's just those free edges of that lace has just been attached down now, look, so that it's attached onto the skirt. Okay. Shut the machine without everything falling off my desk. So we've got this gathering to do yet, but that's okay. What I'm going to do is just undo a few of these little stitches on the edge of the gathering. Careful not to cut through your thread. So just undo a couple, so you've got about 1 centimetre free at the edge. It's only about 2 or 3 stitches for me that needs to come undone. If I can just say, all of these tips and tricks that you're learning for working with lace and with ruffles is exactly the same if you were making a dress for yourself or for a child. So all of the skills that you're learning are absolutely directly transferable across to that type of dressmaking as well. Oops, squeaky chair still. Okay, so let's turn this over just by 1/4 inch and pop our pins in, and we're going to be careful again not to go over our gathering stitches. We don't want to set those gathering stitches, because that will make it more difficult to gather when it comes to doing that section. Just take back as far as you need, just to do that 1/4 inch. Measure it if you need to as well. I'm just going to eyeball it, but you can measure it if you need to, and if you're happy to. Just turn that over, make sure you're turning your lace at the same time, because we want to catch that raw edge of the lace in as well. And then once you've got that in place, just use the nose of your iron just to press in between your pins, making sure not to melt your lace. Just be careful the temperature of your iron, because your lace will melt if you're not careful, because that'll be a polyester lace. And then once we've done one section, just fold it over again, put the pin back in again, and this is just going to give us that lovely neat edge on the back of this apron. We will have to be careful when we are sewing this down, because obviously the next step will be to sew it down, because as we pass over this lace section, it's going to be quite thick and bulky, so we will need to just take our time with that section, but that's okay, we can do that. We're going to do the same on both sides, both of those raw edges. And this is if you're having the pinafore so that it's open at the back, like I am going to do with mine. I'm going to do the same on the other side anyway, so I'll just show you on this one side. And then I'm going to sew it quite close to this folded edge here. So that's our double fold, remember, because then I can manipulate that lace underneath, and it'll make sure that it catches that down so that that stays nice and flat. And that's why I wanted to sew it down on the edge first, so that it's not trying to keep sneaking out all the time, but we've got it in place. So let's just, we're still on a 2.2 stitch, so a couple of stitches forward, a couple of stitches back, and then needling the work. And then just hold on to your back threads if you need to, just to help this all through. Fairly straightforward. I'm going to get my awl into place. So awl is like this, a little pointy tool that helps just hold things in place and hold things together. So let's get a bit closer first. So where it's starting to now sort of want to flick out, I'm going to tuck it under with the edge of the awl and fold it over as best as I can. And then I like to hold it with my awl in place and take a few stitches just slowly. And then I'm going to hold on to the fabric at the back just to put a little bit of pressure. I'm not tugging it, I'm just putting some pressure on, and slow stitches over this bit because we know it's thick. And then eventually you'll feel it just give way and it'll just cooperate with you. That's it. Then just make sure the end is nice and neat down the bottom here. And then reverse on the end. And that will then give you your nice edge. Let's take our starting and stopping threads off. And let's do the same at the top here. And there on the back of our pinafore we've got a lovely neat edge, and that lace is kept down as well very nice and neatly. So I'm now going to go back to this other side here. I'm going to press this exactly the same way, and I do feel it helps it if you press it first before you sew it. It kind of keeps it in place. So I'm going to press it first, and then I'm going to sew this one down to match, and then we'll be ready to attach our skirt to our bodice. Okay, so now let's just unravel our skirt. We've got our two edges nice and neat, and if you're not doing the opening at the back section, you will then follow the same instructions as with the dress for Lillian, where we left a centimetre and we folded it back, and that formed our seam at the end when we had finished. But if you do it that way, you are going to have to just be aware of that centre seam on the ruffle. I mean, at the moment I've got a lovely clear run here, and my seams are at the back. They're fairly invisible, but I do think that if that was centre front, I do think you would notice it. So just be aware of that. The next thing we're going to do now is put our two neatened edges together. We're going to find our halfway point on our skirt, because we're going to do exactly the same as we did with the ruffle, but we're going to be attaching it to the bodice. So I'll tell you what, we can do it this way, can't we? And then that'll make it easier. So once we've got the halfway point, we can fold one raw edge into the middle and find our halfway point there. Put a pin in, and then we can go to this section here, fold that in to the halfway point, and then we'll put another pin in just here. Okay, so now if you want to grab your bodice, because the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put our two side seams together on our bodice. I've got bodice upside down, the side seams, that's the underarm seams. Let's put those two together, and that's going to find us the halfway point on the middle of the bodice. Let me just finger press that, and that'll give me a fold line. Then I can separate it. Now I'm only pinning through the bodice front. I'm not pinning through the back of it, so the lining is still free. Look, we don't want to attach that in. So the next section we're going to do then is we're going to fold this over, and we're going to attach the centre point of the skirt to the centre point of the bodice, so that those two are together. Take one pin out and then put your other one in, and I've still got the heads poking out. Then we're going to find our halfway point here. Oh, shall we gather it? I'll show you this way, because then you can understand why we tend to gather it first. So then you're going to put your side seam, so your quarter point is going to go onto your side seam. Rearrange your pin, and then let's find the other side seam and the other quarter pin and pop those on top of each other. And then at the end here, now because we've got a neatened end, we don't need to leave that centimetre for the seam allowance, because that's going to stay open. So you want to make sure that when you pin your seam your back centre back that we've neatened to the centre back of your dress, it needs to match exactly, so that the seams the ends are together. And then put a pin in there to hold that. Pin it through the seam allowance if you can, because that'll hold it nice and firm. Just make sure you keep your lining free. That's the only important thing. So the lining all the time is being kept free, and it's just the front bodice that is being attached onto the skirt. Let's go down to this other end here now, and then we can use our seam allowance. Make sure those two lines are absolutely perfectly together, and then put a pin in there as well. So I want them to separate. Okay, so perfectly together. And then what we can do is now start to gather. So we're going to now come to the end here. We're going to find our bobbin threads, hold on to those, and then we're going to start and pull our gathers up. Just do it nice and gently until the edges are the same. That's it. So sometimes it's easier to do this before you've actually attached it. So once you've got it the same length, make sure your gathers are even and that you've not got any bald spots or anything, and then you can put a pin in the middle of that to hold that together, with your head poking out again just to hold it. And then we're going to come down to the other side here, and then in the end we'll go to the middle. So we try not to do too big a section in one go with our threads, because as you can see the thread does get fatigued a little bit because you're pulling these fibres along it all the time, the threads against each other, so it does kind of give you a little bit of fatigue on the thread. It's quite tightly packed, these gathers are, but that's what's going to give you the drama of the skirt, which is absolutely stunning. And if your pin wants to undo, just remember you can do that figure 8 again that we did before, you know, or wrap your threads around your pin just to hold on to that, so that when you then move your threads along, it's fine. Just remember to always just pinning through your bodice, you're not pinning through the lining is staying free all the time. So let's go on to this section here. Let's just be careful not to break these threads. We don't want to break them, we just want to stretch them, as she says as she breaks one. So just be careful. Use the back of your quick unpick if you can. That one's better. So let me just pull these up so that they're longer before they disappear. That's it. Now we can separate out the top and the bottom thread from each other, and then we'll be able to pull on the right thread, two threads together. And you have to pull on the same, the top and, so you've got your 2 rows of stitching and you have to pull on both of those threads at the same time, otherwise your your gathers will start to go off at an angle. So if you find that your gathers keep going off at an angle, it's because you're not pulling on your threads equally at the same time. Just pull all of these in, it gets easier as your threads get longer. That's it. And this pinafore is going to be absolutely adorable. I know it seems like quite a lot of work. It does get quicker when you're actually sewing it yourself and you're not having to listen and watch for the instructions, and when you know what you're actually doing. But as I say, all of these skills that you're learning with the gathering and with the hemming, and we're working with the lace, are all absolutely what you would do for children's and adults' clothing if ever you wanted to dabble with that kind of sewing. So don't be put off thinking you can't do it, or that just because you're sewing with children with toy clothes now that you can't do the adult and children, because you absolutely can. Just like I said with the bloomers, the steps for making the bloomers are pretty much exactly the same as if you were making a pair of just casual shorts with an elasticated waist. Exactly the same. The waist, the elastic would be thicker, but that would be the only real difference. Okay, so gathering these up again, as you can see, just to make them the same length as the bodice fabric, because it's a lovely fine fabric, it's gathering up really nicely. Just even out your gathers, make sure they're all sitting straight. All your gathers want to be straight up and down against your skirt. So I've got, can you see here, I've got some that are going off to the side, look, can you see? So I want to just take the time just to straighten those up, so that they're all going sort of straight across those tram lines of gathering stitches, because it will show on the final garment if you don't do that. Okay, I'll just wrap those threads around there. Make sure sure there's no ball patch in the centre front, because you would notice. When they're ready, then you can put a pin in just to hold that again, just in that middle section of the top. So when we've finished, we've got this row of stitches with, not stitches, we've got 2 gathering rows of stitches, but then we've got our pins with our heads out here, and then the lining is still loose. That's correct. You only sew in the bodice to the skirt, the outside of the bodice to the skirt, not the lining. So let's go back to our sewing machine now. Let's get this set up for our machining, and I'm going to put the top of the bodice down so that the bodice goes down against the machine bed and the gathers are up, because then I can control those a little better. On these ends here where we're going to have the centre back of the skirt here, then what I want to do is open this out so that we're sewing a little bit past onto the lining. We're not actually going to sew it, but just for it line, can you see how I've got just the lining there, and then here's the neatened edge of the skirt, and it's absolutely on that seam edge of the bodice, because that's going to give us a nice starting point. And with these small pieces of fabric, it can be a little tricky, but just do what you can to get that lined up properly so that it's on. And then when you're ready, I'm going to take my pin out, hold on to my starting and stopping thread so hopefully you can see. And I'm just going to take just a couple of stitches just to anchor this down. So I can see some of my gathers have already moved. And then needling the work. So what I'm going to do now is just use my awl to just neaten off these gathers so that I can see they're lying flat. I've got the raw edges together of the bodice and the skirt, and then I can sew over these just to hold this together. Just check underneath that your lining's not got flicked underneath. Just keep checking every now and again. And just keep your gathers nice and flat. Just make sure your gathers for your skirt are down, nice and neat. We're going to go to over a seam allowance in a moment. So you can hear the machine change sound as it goes through the thicker part of that fabric. Take the pins out as you go. Hold everything all flat. You can see here where it's wanting to bunch under itself. So I'm just going to, using my awl again, just to neaten everything out to just make sure that it's staying nice and flat. Out. Gathers are starting to go under each other, so just neatening that out a bit. Now as you start to come to this other end, you're just going to have to be careful that your lining sort of kind of give it a little pull on the lining so that it sort of starts to pull out flat. You're not going to have to pull it out all the way flat, so it's not getting folded underneath, otherwise you're going to catch it as you're sewing this edge of this bodice. And then make sure to flatten all of your gathers down as well. And I'm going to just sew a couple of stitches off the end just to make sure that's, and just reverse. Okay, so needle up out of the work. Keep your fingers crossed. Let's make sure that this is just all sewn nicely. These bodices are notorious for flicking under. Feels like we're okay. So I've got a nice row of stitches there. No puckers in the bodice at all. That's looking all nice and flat. So when I fold this up, we've not got any puckers along that edge at all. And I'm checking the skirt and everything looks nice and neat there, so that's fine. So what I'm going to do now is just take off our starting threads so they can come off, and we took off our ending threads already, and then we can cut through the threads in the middle, can't we, that we used for our gathers, and we're going to take our gathering stitches out. And using a different colour thread here, you can see exactly the ones that you want to take out. So for that couple of minutes that it takes just to change your threads over and back again, I do think it's worth it. But then I wouldn't, being as I'm suggesting it. But I think because I've done it both ways, and I've been sewing for many years, then I think I've done the trial and error for you, if that makes sense. So hopefully when I give you these little tips, it is to save you time and frustration rather than to just be pedantic. Right, so now we've got our dress sewn, we've got our skirt attached, we've got the lovely lace attached as well to that lovely full skirt. It is wanting to turn up a bit, but we can always put a couple of stitches just to hold that down, or when we press it, it'll probably stay down. I think it's just the way we've been manoeuvring around with this skirt at the moment. I think it will go down properly. So let's go to the inside of our bodice then, because what we need to do now is let's start at the centre front, because that's the most important part. We're going to turn under 1/4 inch, and then we're going to match that turned under edge right onto where the skirt and the bodice are sewn together, that row of stitches. We're going to put a pin in to hold that. And we're going to go now to the side seam, 1/4 inch under, and then we're going to match that so that we can feel underneath where the other 1/4 inch seam allowance is. That wants to be right on top of itself again. And then we're going to put another pin in to hold that. And then on the end here, just open out that back section there, turn under your 1/4 inch, and then fold it back over itself. And it should then, and you can tuck any fraying edges up inside, and then you're going to put a pin in to hold that in place. So it gives you that lovely nice edge on the back here, look, opening that up. Okay. So just go along. Let's go to the other side now. When you're trying to make it sort of flat, you can feel it with your fingers when the fabric is lying flat and everything's all matching. So just adjust your seam allowance if you need to until that feels nice and flat. And then on the back here again, let's just tip that under and fold it back on itself. And that will then give you that nice edge. So all I'm doing is, can you see where the transition is? There's the skirt and there's the bodice. You see the floral of the bodice and the white of the lining. So the seam allowance goes up into the bodice. I've turned under the 1/4 inch on the for the seam allowance on the lining, and then I'm just wrapping it around that edge, tuck in any little fraying bits that you've got. And then it should all sit flat against itself, because we've cut it from the same pattern, so everything should lie nice and flat. We do our match points first, don't we? And then we know where we are. I've got a few threads, errant threads. So what I'm going to do now is, now in theory you'll see on a lot of people, I'm just taking off some threads here that have just come through when we were stitching it, but we can quality control that in a moment or two. You will see a lot of people say that you can put this back into your machine, and then you can now do a row of stitches, either stitch in the ditch, which is in between the straight edge of the bodice and the gathered edge of the skirt, or just up into the bodice. Now personally, I don't like that finish. I think it just looks messy whichever way you try and do it. And there's not always a guarantee that you're going to catch your lining on the inside. And so one way or the other, one side or the other is always going to be messy. The way to get around that is to thread a hand sewing needle. Got one here. With some thread the same colour as you've been sewing your garment with. And I would do this as well on adult clothing as well as on children's clothing. I wouldn't, I would always just take the time just to hand stitch this, because I don't think that I've never been able to get it to be neat. And if you look inside garments, you'll see others. If you see any handmade garments at a market stall or anything like that, you'll know that you can have a look and see that they've gone for a speedier option, which is fine when you're making to sell, but being as we're making these for forever, then we don't want to cut any corners. So not on the end of your thread. I've got my thread double, could be single. You get my sewing glasses so that I can see what I am doing, because this is close work. And then I'm going to start at the end here, and I'm going to bury my thread, and I'm going to come right out on that edge just here. You see the transition between the skirt and the bodice. And that just buries my thread away from the edge. Tuck your ends up so you've not got those poking out. And then I can see where the stitches are attaching the skirt to the bodice. I'm going to go through one of those stitches and take a little bit of fabric behind it and then a little bit of the edge of the bodice fabric. So it's exactly the same as we did on the inside of Lillian's dress when we made that earlier. And it's just going to finish it all off just nicely for us. So a little bit of a stitch behind and then just catch that folded edge of the bodice where we folded it under. And we're just going to neaten that along the edge. And if you use that stitching at that line of stitches where you've attached the skirt to the bodice, you'll not go far wrong. Oh, the thread's getting caught up on my ruffles. And take your pins out as you go. So the pins are just really to hold your reference points together so that you make sure that it's the same. You know you've got the same amount of the lining in the right place, so that the lining is lying on top of the bodice in exactly the right place. So here we go, just match those two edges up, a little bit through the skirt on that seam allowance, and then you'll get this lovely, just if you get any loops in your thread, just pull them every now and again and it'll just tighten everything up. You don't want to pucker anything up though, so don't pull it too tight, but it should just sit all nice. Little threads, little fray threads occasionally. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and just sew this down, and as I say, I do think it's worth taking the time, but I won't ever know if you don't. But try, you can try it, can't you? You can try sewing along with the machine and you might be able to get a result that you're happy with. I've heard of people using double-sided sticky tape that you can get for sewing and all sorts of things to try and make this a neat edge and being able to machine sew it. But by the time you finish with all of that faff and expense, just taking a few minutes just to attach this isn't so much of a problem. And then when we've done this, I'm going to look out, so like I've got a little bit of fraying edge, a little whisker just here. I'm going to either take that out. If it doesn't come out, I'm going to just go underneath it and just clip it off, just nice and gently. And then I'm going to go over to this side here as well, and I can see I've got a few whiskers where the gathers have been. This is just from the frayed edge of the fabric, and I'm going to snip those really, really close to the skirt just to make sure that they are out of the way. Just be careful not to catch or to snip off. Keep your scissors very flat, don't go in like that. Keep your scissors very, very flat to your seam like that, and you'll find it much easier to just take off those edges and leave very little behind. And just give them a little pull. Sometimes they pull out and sometimes they don't. But just keep everything nice and flat. And that's the best way that I can tell you to be able to catch all of these little threads off without catching any of your lovely gathers and your ruffles. Okay, I'm just going to finish off sewing on the inside, and I'm going to neaten off the outside as well, and then let's meet back here when you've done the same. Just to say, on the end here, when you're wanting to finish off, once you finish off sewing all the way along now, it doesn't take long at all, but rather than cast off right on the edge here and then risk having some stitches, just take a couple of stitches back in again towards the centre of your bodice, because that will take that stitch away from the end. Do a couple of stitches here, or if you're going to do your surgeon's knot, just wrap it around a couple of times just to be able to give you a nice knot. But then what I would suggest you do then is put your needle in your bodice just close to where you've done your knot and it's come out, and then just feed your needle in between the two sets of fabric. So you can see, you can't see my needle there, and you can just see my needle coming out on the edge here, about ½ inch up or so. Because what that's going to do is if you pull that so that you've got no threads there, and then you put some pressure on the threads here, just sort of like just bunch your fabric down only slightly and then snip. When you straighten that fabric out, it'll pull the ends into the bodice for you, and you've got a long tail and it's less likely to come undone then. So the next thing that we're going to do then is, oh, look at this, isn't it looking lovely? So the next thing that we're going to do then is we're going to sew our shoulders together in order to get those looking nice, so that then our character will be able to wear them. So for this I'm going to have the thread single. So let's have the thread single, and I'm going to do just a little knot in there. The first thing I'm going to do though is I'm going to start on the inside a little way in away from the corner, because I'm going to get rid of the knot, because otherwise you're going to have a knot on the edge. So let's just come in and just put our needle through on the corner. You see that there, just sparkling, hopefully, right on the corner. But look where I've gone in on the bodice, can you see? So let's pull that thread through, and that knot just stays there. If you're lucky, you might be able to give the thread a little tug and it might disappear inside like mine has, look. And it's disappeared inside. Now that thread, that knot is now inside, but it won't come out again, so that's fine. If not, don't worry, just do what I'm doing now and we'll come back to that knot. So take a little stitch without pulling too hard, and you're just going to take a couple of little stitches right on the very edge of that seam, just so that when you pull it, it holds it nice. And then we're going to do a ladder stitch. So then fold your stitches together, so two sides of your body. So we've got the two, can you see how I've made the arm? Let me start again, because I've probably not told you that bit. Here's our centre front, and we've taken the edge round the arm side, and we're putting them together like that to give us our armhole. So we'll have the straight edge of the centre back, we'll have an armhole, then we'll have our neck, then we'll make the other armhole, and then the centre back will come back round to the other side. So hopefully that's giving you your bearings. But if you fold your bodice flat either side, you expose that stitch line. And what I want you to do is, whatever side your thread is on, you're going to take a small stitch out of the fabric only. So I'm doing the outer bodice at the moment on the other side, and then come across it, straight across, and do another stitch just there. Whoops, can't get my needle to go in. There we go, another little stitch. Don't worry about pulling it tight at the moment, and then come across to the other side, just taking a few threads, and you're just going to make a ladder of stitches. It's called a ladder stitch, and it's really good for closing things up like this. That's going to make it look really nice and neat and tight. So just taking a stitch through one side, and then wherever my threads, can you see my threads are coming out this side, and you end up with a ladder of stitches across the middle like that. So now, because my thread's on this side, I'm going to come across and directly across from it, and I'm just going to take a little few threads on this side. So you're not trying to sew both sides together. Can they see it? Well, you are trying to sew both sides together, but you're not trying to go through both sides at the same time, because otherwise that is a recipe for disaster. We're so close to this looking absolutely stunning. Just through some threads on this side, and then I'm going to come out on the edge here, right on the point of the shoulder. And then I'm going to come across and take my last stitch just on the edge of that shoulder as well. And I'm just going through the outside fabric, the bodice fabric, not through the lining fabric. Just press on the work sensitive if you need to. And then when you've got this ladder of stitches like this, if you watch, when I pull on this thread gently, not too hard, come on, it should pull all those stitches in together nice and neatly. And if you're careful with it, without pulling too hard, it gives you a lovely, lovely clean finish on that shoulder. Can you see? So now what we're going to do is we're going to go through to the other side. Let's go through to the lining side. And we're just going to do the same thing, just so that we've got that really belt and braces stitched together. So a little stitch out of the lining on the left, and a little stitch out of the lining on the right. And we're going to go all the way along doing exactly the same thing. This is going to give you a lovely neat finish on the top of those shoulders. And this is because we can't turn through a bodice like this how you would do perhaps a child's when it's much wider on the shoulders, because there's just too much fabric. You just wouldn't be able to do it very neatly, I don't think. But I do think that if you use this ladder stitch on the top of the shoulders, you do get a really nice finish anyway. So you're just right on the edge. You're not trying to go into the lining at all. It's almost just right on the very edge. And then we then pull that in again, tighten that up, so that gives it a nice finish on the inside. But now what I'm going to do is going to do a couple of stitches in place on the edge here, going through both sides this time now that we've sort of joined it all together. Just working my way gently in towards the centre again, just a little bit. And I'm on the lining side now. So start on the outside. Then when you get to this point here, let's just do a little knot. So let's do 1, 2, 3 goes round. And then hold on to those wraps around your needle whilst we come down to the very end. So you hold it right down to the end. And then I'm going to put my needle in the work, in the bodice, and I'm not coming out the other side, so the needle's travelling between the two pieces of fabric. I'm going to give it about 1 inch. And then my needle's coming out. Can you see how far down? And then if you pull, you should be able to get that little knot to go inside your work. And then just put some pressure on the thread again and snip it, and the end will pull in the inside, and that's really nice and neatly finished on there for you. So we're going to go ahead now and do the other side here, and then we're going to try it onto Lillian, and then eventually what you'll have is your lovely pinafore, and we're just going to just try it on. So let's just pop it on over her shoulders. The arms go through nicely, which is great. That means the armhole is, or the arm size is the correct size. And we're just going to pull out the gathers on the top of her skirt and tuck her bodice underneath her collar, because that's how that's all got to sit. So pull out the gathers on the top of her dress, make sure that goes up nicely, and just tuck out her collar. Then let's have a look on the back just here. So again, I'm going to do right over left. And we need to have that quite tight because because of the width of the dress underneath. Oh my goodness, look at that. How fabulous does that look? Well, that is very special. Okay, so let me stop getting distracted. And what we've got to do is we're just making sure that we see how much room we've got on the back of this bodice. So the answer is not much. So I think that I am just going to overlap just the minimal amount in order to hold that together. I don't mind that the skirt opens on the back. You may well have followed the instructions for the other skirt, so yours is joined together. But I think either way looks lovely is what I'm trying to say. So I can then sew these onto the back here, and I am going to cover over my press studs again, I think, just so that, because I've only got silver ones. But let's do some. So I'm going to leave the press studs. The press studs is exactly the same as on the dress. So go back to that video and just follow that video if you need a reminder. Or if this is your first video, then look for the I think it's part 5, isn't it? Which was the dress. Part 5B, and that will then tell you how to do the press studs for the back of the dress. But for now, let's carry on with finishing off the front, and I can go back and just do that little finishing off in a minute or two. So I'm going to finish off a little bit while she's wearing it, because I want to be able to position these things in place whilst Lillian's actually got the dress on. So let's have a look at our little finishing bits here. So we've got a lovely piece of pink ribbon, and we've got 2 ribbon roses. So the first ribbon rose is going to go directly down the front of her bodice, directly in between those 2 rows of the lace that we sewed on her other dress. So let's just put a pin through there to hold that in place once that's ready. So you want it about, it depends where you want it, whether you want it, I might put it on the actual waist point, but it depends where you want it to go. So just put a pin through to hold that and maintain its position. We can always, if we just pin it now, we can alter it later. Let's pin the bodice together at the back as well, so that doesn't distort or take our eye away from where it needs to be. Okay, but that's just got that held on. So now we can make sure that that's right in the middle, and I think that's pretty good there. The other one, depending on what, if we look at the picture when we're looking at the box, then we can see there's another little bow that goes to the side just down over here. So let's pop that on with a pin as well, so that that's held on. and I'll show you how to sew those on later, perhaps a little bit lower just on that lace. That's better, isn't it? We're just getting this together so that we can see how it's all looking. So there's our two rosebuds on at the moment, and then with our piece of ribbon, I'm going to, there's two ribbons, two little bows that are on her waist here. So I'm going to take this ribbon and put it in half, because I think they'll be nice, quite nice and long, won't they? Then let's find the half again and let's put a little knot in the top of that, because we're going to make our little bows. So let's put our legs together so that they're pretty much in half. So just get a little knot at the end which will help us hold on to it, and then let's just do our little bow. So first of all I'll tie it first so we've got some big loops, and then I'll just pull back on the ribbon in order that those loops become smaller until you're sure where you want them to be. I want it to hide the knot that we put in first, which we can do. Make sure you've got your little bows even as big as you want. I mean, we can adjust those as well as we're holding those up to her dress. So there's one done. So then these just go to the side of her, go down the side here, look. So let's have one there. Just use a white pin, topped pin, and then hopefully it won't take your eye off it. Pin it in place on the ribbon. And through her dress. So that goes down like that. We can trim these tails off to be as long or as short as we want them to be. And then let's do the same with this one as well and get it on the other side. And then we're just going to sew those on through the dress with just some little stitches going through. I want the loops to be about the same size as well, so that because you're doing one on each side, you want them to be as symmetrical as possible. I'll just move my sewing machine so Lillian can sit against that so you can see her. And we can measure the different distance as well, can't we, when we're actually sewing these on, to make sure that they're the same point of reference across from each other. But I think she's looking absolutely adorable. I hope you feel the same. I hope you're pleased with all your work that you've done. If you've been sewing along with me, then there's a lot of work in these little dolls, but boy is it worth it. Okay, so how's that looking to you at home? Hopefully you're thinking that's looking beautiful and is a good match for our picture on our character. And we've still got our headdress to do yet, so that's going to come next in the next video. But for now, let's get on. We'll just sew these on in place, and then I'll sew the press studs on the back, and then we'll be all ready to go. Okay, so to sew these little bows on, I've got some thread. You can either have it single or double, it doesn't really matter. And then I was happy with where this one was on the skirt, so I've got my pin through the back. So before I take the pin out, I'm just going to put a couple of stitches through, and hopefully that's gone through a little part of the back of the ribbon just to hold it in place. You might need a thimble or something just to hold it in place. And then once I've got that on, then I can just take out the pin holding it in place, because we're going to flatten this ribbon bow. And we're also going to just take some stitches. So I'm going to put my needle through the back of the bow, the ribbon rosebud, and I'm going to come out through the centre of it. Try not to come out part way on the top of a leaf. You can kind of divide the leaves and just separate them slightly, the little buds. Let me just put my glasses down. Hold your lace out of the way, you don't want to catch that. Because I like to put a few little stitches just through the actual rose itself from going up and down. It's sort of like a little stab stitch, isn't it? Because that seems to help hold it in place. So again through the bottom, and then just coming out between the petals, between the can you see just through the rounds of the petals there? and then you can take a stitch down and it sort of anchors it down a little bit better. You can't see your stitches once you've gone through. Let's do another one over here. That's okay. So going up between the petals, if you like, for want of a better sort of explanation. And as you're going round, it'll just help attach that, and it just helps sort of keep the petals of the ribbon rosebud in place as well. Once I've done that, depending on what you want to do, you can always take another stitch and go through the back of these leaves. I'm going to leave mine proud, I think, because I think they are going to look nice like that. But you can actually go through and just stitch those back down if you wanted to. But once we've now gone through some of the petals, you can now do a few stitches going through the back, trying to be as neat as possible. And that's why I've chosen my thread to match my bodice, my dress, rather than the actual rosebud itself. These stitches will help hold everything down in place. And just have a little look at it and just give it a little tug. I can see some stitches there on the actual where it was manufactured, so I'm just going to do a couple of stitches over this side just to help hold it down. You're just trying to just make it look nice and neat and how you want it to be, so that it isn't going to come off. Just watch out for your lace. And it's going to be nice and secure for you. But yeah, I think that's nice and secure now, so I'm going to go down back and into the other side and then just do a few stitches in place to just hold that in place just on there. And then I just take a few little stitches. Well, it's just feed my needle along. You can't see it on the outside, it's just through the ruffles, and that'll just give it a nice long thread to hold on to. So that's that one just there. I'm going to do the same with this one just here, just trying to keep my stitches as neat as possible because it's on the inside and I want to keep that nice and neat. You could have, I suppose you could have attached this before you neaten down the back of your lining, but you know, it's debatable as to how far you go with these. And then on these, I'm just going to make sure that my twists of my loops of my ribbons are lovely and neat. And then I'll just put a few stitches between each one, and I will measure from the centre of the rose out, or well, probably from the side seam actually out, because the centre of the rose can be off centre, can't it, to the centre of each bow, and just make sure they're approximately, well, they are in the right equal on both sides from the other side. And that will then finish that off. And then all I've got to do then is just pop my press studs onto the back, and then we'll be all done and ready for a roundup. Well, what a wonderful afternoon sewing that has been. I have to show you Lillian in all her glory. Isn't she just the sweetest thing that you have ever seen? It's just popping out at the back there because I've left mine open, if you remember. But with the ribbons and her little bows, her little rosebuds, her beautiful white dress, and then her bloomers as well. I mean, everything just goes together just so beautiful. I'm sorry, I'm watching myself in the screen, but it'll make my eyes look funny for you. But how lovely is she, from the lovely pink fabric inside her ears, just everything about her, little puff on her sleeves, everything is just absolutely exquisite. And so, if you know, I'm going to leave it here because that's the end of the actual kit itself, which is Lillian Lamb from Lilly Rose Dolls, which is this one. But I have to say, she doesn't disappoint at all. She looks just like she does in the picture on the screen, and I am absolutely thrilled with her. I'll be picking threads off her for a few days, but I have tried to tidy that along as I've gone. And I think she'll make a lovely, lovely christening gift. You know, they're not toys, they're not to be played with, but you know, just for a fabulous gift, they really, really are lovely, and I'm thrilled. So I hope that you are too. I'm sorry, I'm going to wax lyrical, aren't I, about her, but I hope you're thrilled with her too as well, and that you've enjoyed sewing along with me. The headdress is going to come in a separate video. It isn't part of the kit, so it doesn't actually, the flowers and the little headdress don't come with it, but you there are instructions on how to make it in the kit, so I'm going to follow those instructions and make her little circlet for her next. But just in order to say true for what's in the actual kit, then this is what you'll have at the end of it, your very own Lillian Lamb, looking just as beautiful, hopefully, as mine does too, and hopefully you think that mine does. She has been an absolute delight to sew from start to finish. I've not had any areas where I've struggled with her at all. I've not found any areas particularly complicated. I love this 22-inch size. It's just really, really nice to sew on. And whilst the kit is more expensive for a beginner, I do think that this is a really good place to start if you wanted to try Lilly Rose Doll. Rather than going for the very small ones, which can be a little bit fiddlier, going for something a little bit bigger like this Lillian is going to be really good. And because she's got a flatter nose than some of the others, then I think again that might be a little easier to sew if you are a beginner. But yeah. So my thanks go to Claire and Richard of Lilly Rose Dolls for their generosity in gifting me the kit. I hope that you enjoy the sew along video, and I hope it helps you to make a Lillian that you are super proud of as well. Any comments, then please pop them down below. If you've enjoyed following this video series, do please hit the subscribe button and hit the notification bell, and then that way you'll know if I upload any more videos for Lilly Rose Dolls. And then you may choose to choose a doll or to buy a kit for a doll that I've already got the sew alongs for, which then means you can start with confidence and you don't need to worry. So far I've got Harvey the Hedgehog, and don't forget that if you're making one of the characters, so like the female hedgehog, the baby hedgehog, and Harvey the male hedgehog, they're all the same fundamental pattern underneath. It's the clothes that make them different. So if you wanted to make a hedgehog, then don't be put off because I've done Harvey, who's a male hedgehog, because the female hedgehog is just the same, and it's the same way with the other characters as well. So just be aware of that, because that's a real good way of starting, isn't it, in order that you've got the sew along videos there. Anyway, I'm off to make a headdress next. It might not be today, but because I just want to sit and look at her for a bit longer, but I'm just absolutely thrilled with the way that she's turned out. So thank you for joining me today. Before I carry on, I've enjoyed having you, and I've enjoyed stitching with you and bringing the video to you, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care, everybody. Bye.